She was just 7 years old, wearing a patched dress that had seen better days. But what she did next would bring 70 armed warriors to her doorstep. By sunset the following day, the poorest girl in town would become richer than the banker himself. The dusty main street stretched before the small frontier settlement, where wooden buildings lined both sides like crooked teeth. Clementine Ross pressed her face against the orphanage window, watching the afternoon bustle below. Her stomach growled, reminding her that lunch had been nothing more than thin soup and stale bread again. Mrs. Holloway ran the orphanage with strict rules and even stricter portions, always reminding the children how lucky they were to have a roof over their heads. A commotion outside caught Clementine's attention. Near the general store, she spotted 3 older boys surrounding someone smaller. Tommy Briggs and Jake Morrison, both 12 and known troublemakers, were shoving a dark-haired child who couldn't have been much older than herself. The victim wore traditional native clothing, soft leather decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the sunlight. "Go back where you came from," Tommy snarled, pushing the native boy harder. "We don't want your kind here." The child stumbled but didn't cry out, his dark eyes filled with quiet dignity that seemed far too mature for his years. Clementine's heart clenched as she watched the scene unfold. She knew what it felt like to be powerless, to be pushed around by those bigger and stronger. Every adult on the street seemed to find something else to look at, their footsteps quickening as they passed the confrontation. Jake Morrison grabbed the boy's leather pouch, shaking it upside down. Carved wooden figures scattered across the dirt, and the native child dropped to his knees, frantically trying to gather his belongings before they were trampled by passing horses. One of the bullies kicked dirt over the scattered toys, laughing as the smaller boy's careful work was undone. Clementine's hands pressed flat against the glass, her breath fogging the window. She thought about staying inside, about being safe and invisible like always. Mrs. Holloway would be furious if she left the orphanage without permission, but watching the helpless child below, something hot and fierce bloomed in her chest. The native boy looked up toward the orphanage window, and for a moment their eyes met. In that instant, Clementine saw her own loneliness reflected back at her. 2 outcasts in a world that didn't want either of them. Without another thought, she turned from the window and ran toward the door. Her bare feet slapped against the wooden stairs as she raced down to the main floor. Mrs. Holloway's voice called after her, demanding to know where she was going, but Clementine didn't stop. She burst through the front door and onto the street, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tommy Briggs was pulling back his fist when Clementine threw herself between him and the native child. The older boy's punch caught her shoulder instead, sending her spinning into the dirt beside the scattered wooden figures. Pain shot through her arm, but she scrambled to her feet, placing herself firmly between the bullies and their victim. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted but steady nonetheless. Jake Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that made several passers-by turn their heads. "Look what we got here. The orphan girl thinks she's brave." Clementine's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger, but she didn't move. Behind her, she could hear the native boy gathering his belongings, his movements careful and quiet. She kept her eyes on Tommy and Jake, even as her whole body trembled with fear. "He's just a kid," she said, louder this time. "Pick on someone your own size." "Like you?" Tommy stepped closer, his shadow falling across her face. "You're even smaller than he is." But something in Clementine's defiant stance must have caught the attention of the adults nearby. A few townspeople had stopped to watch, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Mrs. Holloway appeared at the orphanage door, her face thunderous with rage. The native boy tugged gently on Clementine's dress, and when she turned, he pressed one of his carved wooden figures into her palm. It was a small horse, so perfectly crafted she could see every detail of its flowing mane. His dark eyes held a gratitude that needed no words. Then he was gone, slipping through the crowd with the fluid grace of someone who knew how to become invisible when necessary. Tommy and Jake, robbed of their entertainment and aware of the growing audience, slunk away toward the saloon where their fathers would be drinking away the afternoon. Clementine stood alone in the dusty street of every adult eye upon her. Mrs. Holloway's voice cut through the air like a whip, calling her name with a fury that promised punishment later. But as she walked back toward the orphanage, Clementine couldn't bring herself to regret what she'd done. The carved horse felt warm in her palm, and somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats growing closer. The punishment came swift and harsh. Mrs. Holloway's wooden spoon cracked across Clementine's knuckles 3 times. each strike accompanied by a lecture about staying within the orphanage walls and minding her own business. The older woman's gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her disapproving features even thinner. "You embarrassed this institution today," Mrs. Holloway declared, her voice echoing off the sparse walls of the punishment room. "We depend on the goodwill of this community, and you made a spectacle of yourself defending some savage child." Clementine bit her tongue to keep from responding. Her knuckles throbbed, but the pain couldn't touch the warm feeling that still glowed in her chest. She thought of the native boy's grateful eyes and the careful way he'd pressed the carved horse into her palm. No amount of punishment could take that moment away from her. "You'll have no supper tonight," Mrs. Holloway continued, "and you'll spend tomorrow scrubbing the floors of every room in this building. Perhaps that will teach you to think before you act." As evening settled over the orphanage, Clementine lay on her narrow cot, listening to the other children whisper about her confrontation with the bullies. Some admired her courage, while others thought she was foolish for risking Mrs. Holloway's wrath. Her empty stomach cramped with hunger, but she clutched the wooden horse beneath her thin blanket, running her fingers over its smooth surface. Through the small window beside her bed, she could see the hills that surrounded their settlement. Somewhere out there, the native boy was probably eating dinner with his family, safe and warm. The thought made her smile despite everything. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by strange dreams of thundering hooves and painted faces. Just before dawn, Clementine woke to an unusual sound. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but as she pressed her ear to the window, the noise became clearer. Horses, many horses, moving with purpose toward the settlement. She slipped from her bed and peered through the glass. The eastern horizon was just beginning to lighten, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar landscape of rolling hills and scattered scrub brush. Then, like shadows coming to life, they appeared. Riders emerged from the hills in perfect formation, their horses moving with silent coordination that spoke of years of training. Even in the dim light, Clementine could make out the distinctive silhouettes of native warriors, their long hair flowing behind them as they rode. She counted 10, then 20, then stopped counting altogether as more kept appearing. They weren't riding hard like raiders or war parties she'd heard about in whispered stories. Instead, they moved with ceremonial dignity, their pace steady and purposeful. Feathers and beads caught the early morning light, and she could see the glint of weapons. Though they remained sheathed and lowered, the lead rider raised his hand, and the entire group came to a halt just outside the settlement's borders. They formed a perfect semicircle, facing the orphanage directly. Clementine's breath caught in her throat as she realized they weren't looking at the town or the general store, or any of the other buildings. They were looking straight at her window. Mrs. Holloway's voice suddenly erupted from downstairs, shrill with panic and confusion. Other voices joined hers as the townspeople began to wake and discover the silent army waiting at their doorstep. But the warriors didn't move. They simply sat their horses and waited, as if they had all the time in the world. And in the growing light of dawn, Clementine saw something that made her heart race with equal parts fear and wonder. The warrior in the center, clearly their leader, held something in his raised hand. Even from this distance, she could make out its shape. It was a carved wooden horse, identical to the one hidden beneath her blanket. Chaos erupted throughout the orphanage as Mrs. Holloway's screams woke every child and adult within the building. Footsteps thundered across wooden floors as people rushed to windows, their voices rising in panic and confusion. Clementine remained frozen at her small window, watching the magnificent warriors who sat motionless as statues on their painted horses. "Indians!" someone shouted from downstairs. "They're surrounding the orphanage!" Mrs. Holloway's voice rose above the rest, sharp with authority born of panic. "Everyone stay inside. Bar the doors and keep away from the windows." But Clementine couldn't move. The lead warrior, a man whose presence commanded respect even from this distance, continued to hold the carved horse aloft. His long black hair was decorated with eagle feathers, and intricate patterns covered his leather vest. Most striking of all was his face, marked by deep lines that spoke of wisdom and strength, yet somehow familiar in a way that made her heart skip. The settlement below was coming alive with fear. Men emerged from their homes carrying rifles, their faces grim as they took defensive positions behind wooden posts and water troughs. Women gathered their children close, peering nervously from behind curtains and cracked doors. The sheriff, a portly man named Davidson, stumbled from his office still pulling on his boots, his hand resting unsteadily on his gun. "What do you want?" Sheriff Davidson called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. "State your business." The lead warrior's response came not in words, but in action. He guided his horse forward 3 measured steps, then stopped. The movement was precise, respectful, yet filled with unmistakable authority. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the distance, deep and resonant with the weight of absolute certainty. "We seek the brave child who defended my son." A murmur ran through the watching townspeople. Clementine's hand instinctively moved to the wooden horse hidden beneath her nightgown, her mind racing to understand what was happening. The native boy from yesterday had been this warrior's son. The child she'd protected from Tommy and Jake was the son of what appeared to be a chief. Mrs. Holloway appeared in the doorway of Clementine's room, her face pale as parchment. "Get away from that window this instant," she hissed. "They're savages and they're here for revenge." But Clementine had seen the warrior's eyes. Even from this distance, there was no hatred there, no desire for violence. Instead, she saw the same look she'd witnessed in his son's face the day before: dignity, honor, and something else that made her breath catch: gratitude. "He doesn't want revenge," Clementine whispered, pressing her face closer to the glass. "He wants to thank me." Mrs. Holloway grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her away from the window. "Nonsense. They're here to scalp us all for what you did. I should have left you in the streets where I found you." Down below, Sheriff Davidson was growing more agitated. "I asked you to state your business. You can't just ride into our town making demands." The warrior chief turned his attention to the sheriff, and even from her position upstairs, Clementine could see the man wilt slightly under that steady gaze. When the chief spoke again, his words carried the weight of mountains. "My son, Little Bear, was attacked by cowards yesterday. A small girl, alone and without protection, stood between my child and those who would harm him. Such courage must be honored." A ripple of surprise ran through the gathered townspeople. This wasn't the savage raid they'd expected. The warriors behind their chief remained perfectly still, their weapons untouched, their manner respectful yet unmistakably powerful. "Where I come from," the chief continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the settlement, "we believe that courage in the smallest form deserves the greatest recognition. I have brought my warriors not for war, but for ceremony, to honor one who showed true bravery when no adult would act." Mrs. Holloway's grip on Clementine's arm tightened painfully. "They want you," she breathed, her voice filled with terror. "They want to take you away." But as Clementine looked out at the 70 warriors arranged in perfect formation, she didn't see kidnappers or raiders. She saw fathers and uncles, men who understood that protecting children was the highest calling of any warrior, men who had ridden through the night not to take revenge, but to pay respect. The chief raised his carved horse higher, and his voice boomed across the settlement one final time. "Bring forth the brave child. We have gifts that honor her courage, and debts that must be paid." Every eye in the settlement turned toward the orphanage, and Clementine knew there was no hiding from destiny anymore. Mrs. Holloway's face had turned the color of ash. Her hands shook as she gripped Clementine's shoulders, her fingernails digging through the thin fabric of the girl's nightgown. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered fiercely. "I won't let them take you." But the decision was no longer hers to make. Sheriff Davidson's voice carried up from the street below, resigned and nervous. "We need to talk this through peaceful-like. Nobody wants any trouble here." The chief's response was immediate and unwavering. "There will be no trouble if the child is brought forth. We come in honor, not in anger. But we will not leave without fulfilling our obligation." From her window, Clementine could see the townspeople exchanging worried glances. 70 warriors against maybe 20 armed men. The mathematics of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Mrs. Patterson clutched her baby closer to her chest. Old Man Jenkins slowly lowered his rifle, understanding that resistance would only bring disaster. "What kind of obligation?" Sheriff Davidson called out, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. The chief dismounted from his horse with fluid grace, his moccasined feet touching the ground without a sound. 2 other warriors followed suit, but the rest remained mounted, their presence a silent reminder of the power behind their leader's words. "My son told me of her courage," the chief began, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "How she stood alone against those larger than herself. How she took a blow meant for him without hesitation. In our tribe, Such bravery creates a debt that must be honored. Mrs. Holloway's grip tightened even more. They're lying, she hissed in Clementine's ear. Savages don't understand honor. They'll take you and will never see you again. But Clementine was watching the chief's face, seeing the same nobility she'd recognized in his son. When he reached into a leather pouch at his side, she held her breath. What he withdrew made several townspeople gasp audibly. Gold coins caught the morning sunlight, more money than most of the settlers had ever seen in one place. But the chief wasn't displaying wealth for its own sake. He was showing the depth of his gratitude, the lengths to which he would go to honor a debt. This brave child defended my son when grown men turned away, he declared. She risked her safety for another's well-being. Among my people, such actions are not forgotten or ignored. A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Mrs. Henderson whispered something to her husband that Clementine couldn't hear, but she saw them both looking up toward the orphanage window. Other faces followed their gaze, and suddenly Clementine realized that everyone knew exactly where she was. The chief looked directly at her window, and when their eyes met across the distance, she saw a warmth that reminded her of her father, dead these 3 years. "Little one," he called, his voice gentle but carrying clearly. "Will you come down and accept the gratitude of a grateful father?" Mrs. Holloway yanked her away from the window. "Absolutely not. You're staying right here where it's safe." But safe from what? The only thing Clementine felt in danger of was missing the most important moment of her young life. The chief wasn't here to harm her. He was here to honor her, to recognize something in her that no adult in this settlement had ever bothered to see. Behind the chief, she caught sight of a smaller figure. Little Bear sat proudly on a spotted pony, wearing a new vest that gleamed with fresh beadwork. When he saw her in the window, he raised his hand in greeting, holding up another carved animal that caught the light. The debt wasn't just about gold and gifts. It was about recognition, about being seen as someone worthy of respect. And for the first time in her 7 years, Clementine felt the pull of a place where she might truly belong. The sound of heavy boots on the orphanage stairs announced Sheriff Davidson's arrival. His face was flushed from the climb, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Behind him followed Dr. Walsh, the settlement's only physician, and Mayor Cromwell, a thin man whose nervous energy seemed to fill any room he entered. "Mrs. Holloway," Sheriff Davidson began, removing his hat in a gesture of forced politeness. "We need to discuss this situation rationally." Mrs. Holloway positioned herself between the men and Clementine, like a protective barrier. "There's nothing to discuss. This child is under my care and I won't have her handed over to savages." Mayor Cromwell stepped forward, his voice carefully measured. "Ma'am, we have 70 armed warriors outside our settlement. They're not making threats, but their message is clear. They want to honor the girl, and frankly, refusing might not be in anyone's best interest. You're talking about sacrificing a child to save your own skins." Mrs. Holloway snapped, her usual composure cracking under pressure. Dr. Walsh, a gentleman who'd delivered half the babies in the settlement, spoke quietly. "Margaret, I've heard what happened yesterday. The girl showed remarkable courage. Perhaps we should listen to what they're offering before we assume the worst." Through the window, Clementine could see more warriors arriving, their horses appearing from different directions as if they'd been positioned around the settlement all night. But their formation remained respectful, defensive, rather than aggressive. They were making a show of strength while maintaining honor. "The chief mentioned gifts," Sheriff Davidson continued. "Significant ones from what I could see. This could change the girl's entire future." Mrs. Holloway's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You think I care about their trinkets? This child has been my responsibility for 3 years. I've fed her, clothed her, kept her safe when no one else would." But Clementine remembered the thin soup and stale bread, the wooden spoon across her knuckles, the constant reminders of how unwanted she was. Mrs. Holloway's version of care felt more like survival, barely kept above the line of complete abandonment. "Let me go down," Clementine said suddenly, her voice small but determined. "I want to hear what he has to say." All 4 adults turned to stare at her as if they'd forgotten she could speak. Mrs. Holloway's face hardened with betrayal and fear. "Absolutely not. You're a child. You don't understand what you're asking." But Mayor Cromwell was already moving toward the window, his politician's instincts recognizing an opportunity when he saw one. "Actually, perhaps we could arrange a meeting here, in the orphanage, neutral ground, with all of us present to ensure the girl's safety." Sheriff Davidson nodded slowly. That might work. Show good faith without putting anyone at unnecessary risk. Mrs. Holloway's protests grew more frantic, but she was outnumbered now. Dr. Walsh placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Margaret, the girl has already shown more courage than most adults. Maybe it's time we trusted her judgment a little. The decision made, Sheriff Davidson headed back downstairs to relay the invitation. Clementine pressed her face to the window again, watching as he approached the chief with careful, respectful steps. The conversation was brief, conducted in gestures as much as words, and she saw the chief nod once before speaking to his warriors. What happened next took her breath away. The warriors began to dismount in perfect synchronization, each man moving with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. But instead of forming an aggressive line, they arranged themselves in a ceremonial circle around the orphanage, their weapons remaining sheathed, their posture respectful, but alert. 3 of them followed the chief toward the orphanage door, carrying large bundles wrapped in beautifully decorated hide. Little Bear walked beside his father, no longer the frightened child from yesterday, but a young warrior proud to be part of this ceremony. Mrs. Holloway had stopped protesting, her face pale with the realization that events had moved beyond her control. Mayor Cromwell was already heading downstairs to welcome their visitors, while Dr. Walsh remained nearby, his presence a comfort in the growing tension. "Are you frightened?" he asked Clementine gently. She considered the question seriously, running her fingers over the carved horse still hidden in her nightgown. "No," she said finally. "I think I've been waiting my whole life for someone to see me the way he does." From downstairs came the sound of the door opening and voices speaking in careful, formal tones. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor, accompanied by the softer tread of moccasined feet. They were coming upstairs to change her life forever. The chief filled the doorway of Clementine's small room, his presence both commanding and surprisingly gentle. Up close she could see the intricate details of his clothing, the careful beadwork that told stories in patterns and colors, the eagle feathers that marked his status as a leader. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, deep brown and filled with the same quiet dignity she'd seen in his son. Little Bear stood beside his father, transformed from the frightened child of yesterday into a young warrior radiating confidence. When he saw Clementine, he smiled and held up the carved animal he'd been making, a small bear that seemed to dance in the morning light streaming through the window. Mrs. Holloway hovered nervously behind Mayor Cromwell and Dr. Walsh, her hands wringing together as she watched the scene unfold. Sheriff Davidson positioned himself near the doorway, his hand resting on his gun more from habit than threat. "You are the brave one," the chief said, his English careful but clear. "My son, Little Bear, told me how you stood between him and those who would hurt him. You took their anger upon yourself to protect another." Clementine found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "He was scared, and they were being mean. I couldn't just watch." The chief nodded approvingly. "In my tribe, we have a word for such courage. We call it counting coup. But what you did was greater than any warrior's deed in battle. You counted coup on fear itself." He gestured to Little Bear, who stepped forward carrying one of the wrapped bundles. The hide covering was decorated with the same intricate patterns as the chief's vest, and when Little Bear carefully unwrapped it, gasps echoed throughout the small room. Inside lay the most beautiful dress Clementine had ever seen. Made from soft deerskin dyed in rich earth tones, it was decorated with hundreds of tiny beads that formed patterns of horses and eagles. The sleeves were fringed with what looked like real silver threads, and the hem was adorned with small bells that chimed softly when Little Bear lifted the garment. "This was made by the women of our tribe," the chief explained. "Each bead was placed with gratitude for your courage. Each pattern tells the story of how one small girl's bravery touched the hearts of many. But the dress was only the beginning." Little Bear unwrapped a second bundle, revealing a pair of moccasins so perfectly crafted, they seemed to glow with their own inner light. The leather was softer than anything Clementine had ever touched, decorated with the same intricate beadwork as the dress. Mrs. Holloway stepped forward, her voice shaking. "These are beautiful gifts, but she's just a child. She can't accept such valuable things." The chief turned his attention to her, and his expression remained respectful, but firm. "In my world, courage has no age. When someone risks themselves for another, they become worthy of the greatest honors we can bestow." From his own pouch, he withdrew a leather cord strung with what appeared to be precious stones. But as he held it closer, Clementine realized they weren't stones at all. Each bead was a carved animal, tiny works of art that must have taken months to complete. "This necklace belongs to my family," he said. "It was worn by my grandmother, who was known for her courage in protecting children during the hard winters. She would want it to belong to another who shares her brave heart." Little Bear stepped closer to Clementine, his eyes bright with excitement. "My father says you can come live with us if you want. Our tribe needs brave people, and you would be honored as a daughter of courage." The room fell silent, except for the soft chiming of the bells on the dress. Mrs. Holloway's face had gone completely pale, while Mayor Cromwell and Dr. Walsh exchanged meaningful glances. This wasn't just about gifts anymore. This was about a completely different life, a place where Clementine's courage would be celebrated rather than punished. Through the window, she could see the 70 warriors still maintaining their respectful formation, waiting for her decision. But the choice before her was bigger than she'd ever imagined possible. The chief reached into his final bundle and withdrew something that made everyone in the room gasp. Gold coins spilled into his palm, more wealth than the entire settlement had seen in years. But he didn't stop there. Silver jewelry followed, intricate pieces that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes across the walls. "This is not payment," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "This is recognition. Where I come from, courage like yours is honored with the greatest treasures we possess." Mrs. Holloway's objections died in her throat as she stared at the fortune displayed before them. Mayor Cromwell calculated quickly in his head, realizing that the gold alone could transform the orphanage from a struggling institution into a thriving home for children. But the chief wasn't finished. He gestured toward the window, and Clementine looked out to see several warriors leading horses forward. Not just any horses, but magnificent animals with flowing manes and intelligent eyes, their saddles decorated with the same careful beadwork that adorned everything else the tribe had made. "These horses are yours," the chief continued. "In our tradition, a brave person must have transportation worthy of their courage. These animals will serve you faithfully, whether you choose to stay here or come with us to our camp." Little Bear stepped beside Clementine and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "My father says you could be my sister if you want. We could ride together and learn the old stories. I could teach you to carve animals like the horse you kept." Clementine looked down at the carved horse still clutched in her other hand, then up at the faces surrounding her. Mrs. Holloway's expression had shifted from fear to wonder as she contemplated what this wealth could mean for all the children in her care. Dr. Walsh smiled encouragingly, while Sheriff Davidson nodded with newfound respect. "I don't understand," Clementine said softly. "All I did was stand up to some bullies." The chief knelt down so his eyes were level with hers, and when he spoke, his words carried the wisdom of generations. "Little brave one, most adults spend their entire lives without showing the courage you displayed in a single moment. You saw someone in need and acted without thinking of yourself. That is the rarest gift in any world." He placed the necklace around her neck, and the weight of it felt like acceptance, like belonging, like finally being seen for who she truly was. The carved animals seemed to warm against her skin, each one a reminder that courage came in many forms. "You have a choice to make," the chief said. "You can stay here with these gifts, using them to build a better life in this place, or you can come with us, to learn the ways of a people who understand the value of a brave heart." Clementine looked around the small room that had been her world for 3 years. The thin walls, the scratchy blankets, the constant reminders that she was unwanted and burdensome. Then she looked at Little Bear's hopeful face, at the chief's kind eyes, at the magnificent life being offered to her. But most importantly, she looked at Mrs. Holloway, who despite her harshness, had kept her fed and sheltered when no one else would. The gold and silver would transform this place, giving other orphan children chances they'd never had before. "Can I visit?" she asked the chief. "Can I come back to see Mrs. Holloway and the other children?" The chief's smile was as warm as summer sunshine. A brave person always honors their connections. "You would be welcome to travel between both worlds, carrying courage wherever you go." Little Bear squeezed her hand. "And I could visit here too. We could be friends in both places." Mrs. Holloway stepped forward then, her voice thick with emotion. "Clementine, child, this is your chance for a real family. Don't worry about an old woman like me." But Clementine saw the tears in her guardian's eyes and understood that beneath the strict rules and harsh punishments, there had always been love. Imperfect love, perhaps, but real nonetheless. "I'll take the gifts," she said finally, "but I want to use them to help everyone. The gold can make this place better for all the children, and I want to learn from both families, the one that raised me and the one that sees my courage." The chief stood and placed his hand on her head in blessing. "Spoken like a true leader. You have the wisdom to bridge two worlds." Outside, the 70 warriors began a rhythmic chanting that spoke of honor and acceptance. The poorest girl in the settlement had become its greatest treasure, and her courage had built a bridge between two peoples who had forgotten how to trust. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Clementine knew her life had changed forever, not just because of the gold or the horses or the beautiful clothes, but because she had finally found people who saw her true worth. And in the distance, she could already hear the sound of children laughing, imagining the better world her single act of courage was about to create. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.